Have your attention just a minute. Can I have your attention just a minute? We want to welcome you all here, this 50th anniversary of the judgment of the first Nuremberg Trial, and to celebrate our association together in Nuremberg and all our friends who've come here as well. I do want to welcome you on behalf of the Nuremberg Reunion Committee, and to say that we hope you've found enough room on the agenda so that you can interact in small groups and in large groups informally, so that you can ask questions of the panelists and of the speakers, and so that you can all be a part of this affair. Once more, on behalf of the committee, welcome, and please carry on. Thank you. Today, Senator Christopher Dodd, who has very close connections to the Nuremberg trial and to its significance in several capacities. In the first place, his father was Tom Dodd, the Executive Trial Counsel at Nuremberg, and also he's been so interested in things pertaining to international law, collective security. He worked with the University of Connecticut to establish the Thomas J. Dodd Research Center, where a number of us here have visited, and believe me, it is a wonderful center for research on the Nazi regime and, of course, on the trial itself. Senator Dodd has distinguished himself in many ways on the Hill, which I will not go into. I will merely say that we're very proud to have Senator Dodd come here to make the first talk to this reunion. Senator Dodd.
Well, thank you very, very much, and my apologies to all of you for being a few minutes late and coming down. Drex was very kind not to mention another function that I have taken on over these last few months. The President asked me to be the General Chairman of the Democratic National Committee, in addition to my day job as a senator. Now, I hear one half of the room clapping in silence from the other. And I'll tell you, this is not something that I was overly anxious to take on. The only other people who ever did this, Bob Dole, in fact, he was General Chairman of the Republican National Committee back in 1972, while he was a sitting member of the United States Senate, and Paul Laxalt did it for President Reagan in 1984 as well, while he was a sitting senator. I went to Bob Dole, and before I agreed, the President asked 3 times, I said no twice. It's hard to turn down a President on a 3rd time around, but I went to Bob Dole, I said, Bob, what about this? Can you do this? Oh, he said, listen, it's tough, let me tell you. He said, to try and be a senator and do these things on weekends and nights and mornings. He said, I'll tell you one thing you got to watch out for. He said, now, I was General Chairman of the Republican Party in 1972. He said, now, one thing you got to watch out for, he said, that White House, they won't pay any attention to you down there. He said, and then by 1974, I can't tell you how happy I was that they paid no attention to me in 1972. So he said, be careful how close you are. The reason I tell you that is, as I say, this title is a lofty one. It's not just chairman, I'm General Chairman. I think I'm probably the only person east of Beijing, China, with a title like that of a party. General Chairman of so we're wearing a Mao hat, I guess, as I go around. But since I only rose to the rank of corporal in the United States Army, I like being called General. This is one way I've gotten promoted along the way. But I've enjoyed it immensely going around. And the reason I'm a bit late here this morning is because we're not in session today, and we had some meetings on the budgets. We've got, thank God, only 33 more weeks. May seem like a lifetime to you, but 33 more weeks between now and Election Day. And so we're obviously a great issue of great concern and import, and that's what tied me up a bit. So my apologies in not being down here to be with you earlier. And I can't thank you enough for the wonderful invitation, Drex, to be here and today, and how I wish that I could spend the weekend with you just to reminisce. So many of you over the years have been so kind. I can't tell you the number of letters I've received from people who knew my father at Nuremberg and stayed in touch with him over the years. The anecdotes, the stories, the articles and so forth that have come across, all of which I've sent up to the University of Connecticut at the Thomas J. Dodd Archival and Research Center. In fact, some correspondence with my father. There's a woman in Washington, she's one of the top editorial writers of the Washington Post. Her dad worked in the Justice Department with my father and knew each other well prior to Nuremberg, and my father wrote him lengthy letters from Nuremberg about his experience. She gave me all the letters her father had gotten from my father, so that those are just part of that record as well. So I'm very moved to see many of you here. Many of you I saw, as Rex pointed out, up at the University of Connecticut for the dedication ceremony last fall, when President Clinton graciously came up and dedicated the building, and we made it really the whole, not the dedication, but all year long, is dedicated to the 50th anniversary of Nuremberg and the rule of law. In fact, Linda Perrone, who's here with us today from the University of Connecticut. Linda, why don't you stand up? I'd like Linda to stand up. This is a wonderful person. Did a great job. Has really organized all of this year's activities at the University of Connecticut. But we wanted it, I wanted it to be around the Nuremberg experience. Obviously, my dad served in the Justice Department, an FBI agent in the House, the Senate, and they were all important events in his life. But what I'd like to mention to you today is the single most important event. And any one of my 5 other brothers and sisters, were they standing here, would tell you this. The single most important event of his life, in terms of what shaped his views, was his experience as a young man at Nuremberg, without any question whatsoever. And just day after day, week after week, I can't tell you what a diet his 6 children received around the dining room table of the experience at Nuremberg. And I'm convinced it shaped his views on almost every other issue he embraced, both at home and abroad. And so he would, I think he'd very much like me to be here today. I know, I got it. It's been 25 years. It'll be 25 years next month. My father passed away a quarter of a century ago, and he'd like me to be back for many reasons, not the least of which, how he would have loved to spend a weekend with all of you. And my mother would have, who was stayed home with 5 children in Lebanon, Connecticut during those years. So I'm delighted to be here, and I thank you for your patience. And again, I apologize for being a bit late. Let me first, as I said a moment ago, tell you what pleasure it is to see so many of you gather from around the country and the world, for that matter, to be here. My father often said, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, that his participation in the Nuremberg trials was truly the seminal event in his public life. The 15 months he spent in Germany prosecuting Nazi war criminals defined the type of lawmaker that he would become, and dedicated the issues that he so passionately fought for through his career in the United States Senate. My father came away from the Nuremberg experience with a greater understanding and fervor for the need to uphold freedom and human rights, and to speak out against intolerance, tyranny, and violence wherever it may rear its head. It's why he championed so vigorously to establish genocide and crimes against humanity as violations of international law. It's why he was such a fervent advocate for civil rights and the civil rights movement in this country. And it's why he fought so hard as a United States Senator to eradicate the scourge of gun violence and drug use from our nation's streets. And while I take great pride in the role my father played at Nuremberg, my appreciation for your efforts is also very great. When the gas chambers, death camps, and wanton destruction that Nazism had wrought in Europe was revealed, you, all of you gathered here today, were burdened with a grave responsibility to not only punish the guilty, but to reassure the world that future generations would never forget the horrors and atrocities of the Nazis. It was not an easy task, particularly when the weight of the living was compounded by the ghosts of history that stood behind you. At Nuremberg, your voices spoke for the millions of innocents who drew their final breaths at Auschwitz, Treblinka, Dachau, and so many other places. At Nuremberg, your vigor and energy guaranteed that millions who suffered so egregiously from London to Leningrad would see justice prevail. And at Nuremberg, you affirmed that those who committed some of the worst atrocities the world had ever witnessed would ultimately be held accountable for their crimes. Reading through my father's letters to my mother, and as many of you know, he wrote her every single day, without exception, from Nuremberg, an average of 8-page letters, every single day for the 15 months that he was there. sharing with her his feelings and his frustrations. And Lord knows there were a lot of frustrations reflected in those letters, particularly in the early days, when the process was just beginning, that all of you must have felt as to one time or another you tried to set up this process. But what is even more apparent in those letters are the deep character, humanity, and integrity that he felt for all of those who toiled so emphatically in the name of justice and the rule of law. I think my father summed it up best in one of his letters to my mother when he said, and I quote him, "Sometimes a man knows his duty, his responsibility so clearly, so surely, that he cannot hesitate. He does not refuse it. Even great pain and other sacrifices seem unimportant in such a situation. The pain is no less for this knowledge, but the pain has a purpose, at least." End of quote. But as these words remain relevant and enduring today, so too are the legal doctrines and precedents that you pioneered at Nuremberg. Nuremberg enshrined into international law the principles that war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide would not be tolerated. It declared that respect for human rights was an international responsibility to be maintained and venerated by all the nations, civilized nations, on the face of this earth. And it held that evil would not be faceless. Those responsible for crimes against humanity would be exposed to the world. I think the words of Chief Justice, or the Chief Prosecutor in Nuremberg, Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson, and William, let me tell you what a great pleasure it is to be with you. As I told you when I came in, I feel like I know you because reading again my dad's letters and his great affection for your father. It's just all through those letters. And the reverence that my father held for Justice Jackson, we grew up with day after day, his talk about your father. But nonetheless, I'm going to quote him, your father, numerous times here because they were in the letters to my dad, and of course in his statements as well. But in his eloquent reminders, in fact, this morning on Good Morning America, they had your father's remarks. Again, I thought, Drex, you'd really done a great job organizing the media here because you had ABC Good Morning America talking about Nuremberg here this morning. But they used Justice Jackson's words that he used as reminders of the goals of Nuremberg. And I quote them again, and they're worth repeating. "The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated." However, while my father left Nuremberg with invaluable lessons that compelled him to fight for freedom and human dignity around the world, the international community, unfortunately, largely has disregarded the lessons of Nuremberg. My father, like many of you, left Nuremberg envisioning a world in which the rule of law would deter future tyrants, where international tribunals would mete out fair yet swift punishment to those who would commit crimes against humanity. Sadly and unfortunately, that vision has largely gone unfulfilled. If we had taken the lessons of Nuremberg to heart, the ghastly killing fields, in my view, of Cambodia might never have happened. If the international community had forcefully enshrined the legal precedents of Nuremberg, the perpetrators of atrocities, of atrocious violence in the past half-century, from Idi Amin and Pol Pot to Saddam Hussein, the death squads in Central America, Tiananmen Square in China, and countless other places, would have been forced, I think, to justify their behavior under the harsh spotlight of international jurisprudence. Regrettably, in 1996, the legacy of intolerance and hatred that was prosecuted at Nuremberg lives on in the smoldering suburbs of Sarajevo and the mass graves of Kigali. But commemorating your accomplishments of the past should give us reason to redouble our efforts for the future. Now, just as at the end of World War II, we find ourselves in this country at the cusp of a new international era. We have the opportunity to make good on the lessons of Nuremberg and enshrine into international law the notion that those who violate the norms of basic human rights will not escape from the long arm of justice. Today we can see those efforts take flight as the international community is working to bring suspected war criminals to trial in Bosnia and Rwanda. These tribunals seek to punish those responsible for outrageous crimes against humanity, but at the same time begin the process of reconciliation for countries torn apart by violence. Without justice in Bosnia and Rwanda, the cycle of violence may only continue. In fact, I would predict with certainty it would. Effective and fair tribunals still silence the calls for retribution and remove the heavy burden of collective guilt from entire communities. Let us remember that not all Serbs or all Hutus are murderers. Most, the overwhelming majority, seek only to enjoy the quiet miracle of life. They strive for simple normalcy. They want only to raise their children in peace and to make an honest living among neighbors in which they have only trust and not fear. These tribunals hopefully will punish those Serbs and those Hutus who are guilty of these crimes. But at the same time, it will allow the vast majority of people who have committed no crime to work with their neighbors in beginning the national healing process. Yet these tribunals serve another effective role, in my view, to demonstrate to future tyrants and murderers that ultimately, no matter how long it takes, they will be held accountable. Some scoff at the notion of international tribunals. They certainly did at Nuremberg, they do today. And they say that we cannot prevent future genocides. But we must remember that the Hutu murderers in Rwanda took inspiration. They took inspiration from the failure of the international community to act after similar ethnic massacres in Burundi, much in the same way that Hitler took inspiration from the world's inaction in the wake of the Armenian genocide in 1915. In Burundi in 1993, 50,000 ethnic Hutu and Tutsi were savagely murdered, while the international community did nothing, absolutely nothing, to stop the violence. In addition, no procedure to prosecute the perpetrators of these heinous crimes was ever established. The result, in my view, was an emboldened Hutu majority who had little fear, in fact no fear, of punishment from the international community. There is no better way to foil the intentions of the world's would-be tyrants and killers than through the establishment of a permanent international tribunal to prosecute those responsible for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. At the dedication ceremony for the Dodd Research Center at the University of Connecticut, President Clinton, as you all know, called for the creation of a permanent international tribunal. I commend him, as I'm sure all of you do, for his foresight, his vision, and his courage. And I call on all of us who understand so well the importance of international justice to work with the President, members of Congress, and others to build a popular body of support for this idea. There's so many out there who are opposed to this idea, who scare people about the idea of an international tribunal. And if those who know better remain silent, they will prevail in the debate. There ought to be a popular groundswell of support for the notion and the idea of an international tribunal. If we stand for anything, we ought to stand for that. Permanent international tribunal would send, I think, a clear signal to those intent on using the cover of war to commit terrible atrocities that they would be held culpable for their behavior. Will an international tribunal stop all future atrocities? Obviously not. We all know that. Regrettably, that's the case. No one would suggest that would be the case. There will be more Yugoslavias, there'll be more Rwandas, there'll be more Burundis, unfortunately. But I believe that a permanent international tribunal would create a lasting framework for the prosecution of war criminals. It would prevent justice from being contingent on ad hoc measures, such as those we've seen in Bosnia and Rwanda. And it would quicken and normalize the implementation of humanitarian laws. As I don't have to remind any of you in this room today, establishing an international tribunal and prosecuting war criminals can be a messy patchwork, an operation. And no one knows that better than all of you here. In Nuremberg, there were few legal precedents by which to model their trial. In particular, new doctrines and concepts in international law had to be created almost on a daily and hourly basis at Nuremberg. War crimes may be familiar to the world today, but in 1945, they were not defined in any international or even national legal sense. The same can be said of crimes against humanity, which was a concept that remained untested in international law. In Nuremberg, you and those who were with you not only had to prosecute Nazi war criminals, but you had to establish international laws under which they would be tried. As Justice Jackson noted at Nuremberg, never before, and I quote him, never before in legal history has an effort been made to bring within the scope of a single litigation the developments of a decade covering a whole continent and involving a score of nations, countless individuals, and innumerable events. But the creation of a permanent tribunal would revamp the currently ad hoc nature of international tribunals. It would streamline the process of prosecuting those who commit crimes against humanity. But most important, it would serve as an enduring tribute to your tireless labors at Nuremberg on behalf of the international rule of law. In many ways, the question of international jurisprudence and the rule of law, while maybe mundane to some, is the embodiment of the spirit of Nuremberg. After Germany's surrender, and once the ghastly atrocities of the Holocaust were revealed, the impulse to lash out in vengeance at those responsible for these crimes was understandable. Some leaders echoed these thoughts. Winston Churchill, for one, called for the immediate execution of all Nazi leaders without any trial, without any jurisprudence. But the United States and its allies ended this war the same way they had fought it, by embodying, as Abraham Lincoln once said, the better angels in our nature. The struggle of World War II is as close as any civilization may find. There are other similarities, but one of the best, where you had a pure struggle between good and evil. And not only did the forces of good triumph on the battlefield, but they triumphed in the courtroom of Nuremberg as well, while millions of innocent Jews and others stood on the railroad sidings at Auschwitz and Treblinka, Dachau, and other lugars, and other places, to be chosen for the gas chambers. They were unjustly stripped of their rights and their liberties. They weren't granted the right of due process. They weren't given the right to defend themselves or to speak on their own behalf. In the concentration camps, the only form of justice was down the barrel of a gun or a gas chamber. But at Nuremberg, the Allies recognized that the only antidote to savagery and inhumanity is justice. That's why defendants were given the right to defend themselves. That's why they were given the right to choose their own legal representation. And it's why there were three of them that were actually acquitted of all charges at Nuremberg. Whatever the legacy of Nuremberg on international law, my father and every person in this room who was a part of that great legacy can look back and remember that when the deafening calls for vengeance were heard, you silenced them. You silenced them with the sounds of justice. Once again, I hark back to the words of Justice Jackson in describing these actions, that four great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. Looking through my father's letters, I came across a wonderful, wonderful anecdote from his time in Nuremberg. Some of you may have even been there. It was only after a few weeks in the country in the summer of 1945 that he had the opportunity to go to a baseball game at the very same Nuremberg stadium where Hitler corrupted and misled the youth of Germany. But on that day, the voices of evil that had once found shelter in Nuremberg were replaced by 40,000 Americans doing the most American of things, watching a baseball game, calling the umpires and players bums. In many ways, something as wholesome and American as baseball is a wonderful metaphor for the triumph of American optimism, American ideals, and American democracy over the forces of intolerance, depravity, represented by Nazism. In Nuremberg, America's commitment to democracy and the ideals enshrined in our Constitution remained intact, even in the face of unspeakable horror. In many ways, this is your ultimate legacy of Nuremberg, those of you who were part of that historic event, that our triumph in arms led to the triumph of our ideals. When historians will look back at the events that unfolded in the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg 50 years ago, it is that proud legacy, that you created, that they will remember. And today it is our responsibility to make sure that the heritage lives on for generations to come. For the past 50 years, through wonderful books such as Telford Taylor's The Anatomy of the Nuremberg Trials, and now the facilities that we've mentioned already at the Dodd Center in Connecticut, you've kept the events of a half a century burning bright in the world's eyes. Tirelessly, and Drex, I commend you as well for what you've contributed in this effort. Tirelessly, you've worked to illuminate the lessons of those bygone days to a world that seems so quickly to forget the lessons of history. Our duty today, obviously, is to build on that proud tradition with the creation of an international tribunal to prosecute war crimes. Our success will guarantee that when all of mankind looks back to Nuremberg, they will salute every man and woman in this room who so firmly enshrined justice into the international rule of law. And I can think of no better way to give your labors at Nuremberg a truly lasting and tangible imprint on human history. And I thank you for listening to me.
Lattimer wasn't known to a lot of us in Nuremberg, but he was very much there because he was down in the prison with the defendants. He was the physician to the defendants, and hence he had some contacts and some approaches that none of the rest of us had, because the only time we saw the defendants was maybe when they were under interrogation, or when they were in the dock, or when they were on the witness stand. But Dr. Lattimer was in a position to be much closer to them as their physician, and as he said, he kept them alive so that we could try them and finally sentence a few of them to death. Dr. Lattimer came back to the United States and became a distinguished professor at the College of Surgeons and Physicians at Columbia University. And he and I have been in contact a few times since. He favored us at the second reunion with some presentations which were very astounding and interesting, and we've asked him to come back, Dr. John P. Lattimer.
Well, thank you, Dr. Sprecher. Ladies and gentlemen, those of you in the back that won't be able to see, you want to move up, it's all right. I have so many new things to tell you about, show you, that I'll speed along. And Carolyn, if we can have the first slide, Carolyn. Here's our friend Hess, the Enigma, and here he is doing what he often did, pounding his knee with apparent pain, where he pounded the furniture. And he'd always claimed he had this gallbladder problem. Well, he didn't have any gallbladder problem. He'd been using that excuse all along, but I examined him, and he never had any obvious gallbladder trouble. And the next slide is the doctor that you all met that ran the dispensary there, and he examined him, and he didn't find any gallbladder trouble. And at the autopsy, there was no gallbladder trouble. There was no ulcers, and he was having gas cramps all this time, and making the most of it. Very skillful actor. And the next slide. Well, then, you know, he was in Spandau, and the Russians wouldn't let him go, and they built this. He was finally at age 93, the only prisoner in this big prison, and they built this little pergola for him so he could be out in the garden, and he was relaxing out there, and Khrushchev decided he'd finally release him. Well, 2 days later, before they could get him out of there, he was found in dying condition near this pergola with a wire around his neck, and two strangers there when the nurse came back from lunch, and he died the next day despite any efforts to save him. And at the autopsy, the next slide, his son called me because the wire mark around his neck runs straight across. Now, if you hang yourself, then the line of the wire runs down and then up again, and it doesn't run straight across. If somebody garrots you and kills you, it runs straight across like this. Furthermore, when you hang yourself, there's two little bones in your neck, and the hanging loop is above them. It doesn't bother them. But if they garrote you, they're broken off, and his were broken off. So his son is sure that the British went in there and killed him for fear of what he'd say about the 4 years the British had him when he made his escape to England, or his flight to England. Well, the British aren't about to release any information for them until after the turn of the century, so we're still up in the air. But I thought you'd like to see what the evidence was when this big argument comes up again. And the next slide. Well, let's skip on to the Admiral, Donitz, the cold, stony-faced Admiral. When he would write a note to Dr. Fleuker, our German POW doctor that was so good, he would write it in verse. And the next slide, there was a letter that he wrote asking for more marmalade, and everything rhymes. So he was the last person I thought would be a poet, was Donitz. And the next slide, after this, well, and Dr. Fleuker, that was, I say, very good as an interface between our doctors and Dr. Roska, for instance, that I showed you before, and the patients. He was written a note by all of the prisoners in gratitude for all he did for them. And the next slide, the notes at the top, and again, it's in rhyme, and they all signed it. Even Rader signed it, and you know Rader and Donitz were at sword points all the time, so it must have been good. Well, as I say, it was such a surprise to me to find among my collection these two evidence of poetry from the crusty old Admiral that I thought you'd be interested. And the next slide. Well, here's the fountain pen that Donitz used to write all those notes. Notice the end of the cap is chewed off. I have the pens that a lot of them use, and almost always the cap got chewed off. And the next slide. And this is a photograph of a U-boat towing a group of lifeboats away. Remember, both admirals got off without being executed, whereas both the generals were executed. And it's this kind of thing that very cleverly got them off, I thought. The fact that this U-boat is towing these survivors from the ship they torpedoed to safety, maybe contrary to Hitler's orders, and as a consequence, the admirals were thought of in a more kindly light than the generals. And the next slide. Well, this is, I show it to show Van Neurath in the upper right. What it is, it's a frame of Hitler's neckties that I got from his chauffeur, Kempka. And the two on the outer sides are his khaki neckties that you see him wearing at the bottom. And his white tie that he occasionally put on with white tie and tails is in the middle. But look at old Van Neurath, the crusty old diplomat, patting Hitler on the shoulder, and Hitler is looking daggers at him. And it wasn't any surprise to me that Van Neurath got himself fired and replaced with Ribbentrop. And the next slide. Well, here is Speer, and Speer, you know, this is Eva Braun on his arm, because Eva didn't have much to do with Hitler away so much, so she would go from the Berghof over to the Speer house that I'll show you in a minute, with the Speer family. And Speer made up this little monogram for her that you see on the left with her two initials back to back to make a butterfly. Well, she loved that, and she embroidered it on all her things that you see here. And the next slide, here is her evening bag. She had beautiful things all from Paris. And inside, the next slide, is the same monogram at the lower center. There are two initials back to back, this time with a little tail on it, so it could be described as a four-leaf clover, which Speer favored as the interpretation. The next slide. And here was Speer's house at Berchtesgaden. This was around the corner away from the Berghof, so you didn't see it from the Berghof. Very beautiful little house. Now, some of you may have stayed there, as I did, for a little R&R, and know it. Well, in any case, the next slide. Hitler was always tossing off architectural sketches for Speer and telling him to develop it, and then maybe they'd build it later, because Hitler would repeatedly say that men are remembered only by the monuments they live by or leave after them, and citing the pyramids and the Eiffel Tower and so forth. And so he would sketch these things. And the next slide, here's one of them for a memorial arch and stadium looking over the Linz where Hitler was his native town. And a letter on the right from Speer authenticating it and saying that this was drawn in his presence by Hitler on such and such a date. Speer made a catalog of 100 or more of these that he saved, and I have several of them. And this is what they look like. Hitler wasn't too bad at these hasty sketches, and in fact, Speer was pleasantly surprised at how good he was at it. And the next slide. Well, here's the only one that really got built. This is the big Zeppelin Stadium at Nuremberg that you all saw. And this is after George Patton dynamited off the big Nazi swastika that used to be up there in the center and replaced it with the next slide, the Third Army A. And many of you probably did as I did here, got up in Hitler's place, imitated him. And, but it was a beautiful piece of Carrara marble, a quarter of a mile long, that one side. It's the one that Senator Dodd was saying they now play baseball in. In fact, you could put 20 football fields inside it, and yet he would carpet it with steel-helmeted troops, a row of searchlights around the outside, and it was very imposing. Well, it's the only one that got built, and it's now an automobile racetrack. And the next slide. Well, in my previous units of the 101st Airborne Division, one of our units was assigned the honor to capture Berchtesgaden. Well, going along, the citizens said, wait a minute, there's somebody here you should pick up, and this is Live, a labor leader. And he was hiding out, pretending he was a teacher, and the citizens didn't like him. He would get up and say anything in the world. He'd give speeches to the labor people, and he promised them the moon. And they would cheer him, and of course Hitler loved that. He didn't mean anything of it. Well, in prison, he made these extravagant statements with no basis. And our psychiatrist, the doctor, next slide, Dr. Kelly, that many of you knew, our first psychiatrist, a very charming man, he said, you know, this man Lie's got something wrong with his frontal lobes. Well, at the autopsy, the next slide, sure enough, his frontal lobes are all shriveled up. He hanged himself in his cell early on. The next slide. Well, another one we picked up in our area was Stryker. Well, Stryker had gotten away from his farm and was pretending to be a landscape painter. He could paint a little bit, and he had this paint-spattered coat, a hat, and some paints, and he had let his beard and hair grow in, and they came in white. And you remember he was a black-bearded, black-headed, cue ball haircut type. Didn't look anything like the pictures we had of him, and we didn't believe it. But the natives said, no, that's him. And so we picked him up. And at one of the interrogation points, he was being interrogated by newspaper people, and the agent, CIC agent that had him in tow, was with him, and these black guards were shown a picture of what he had said about black people in his Stürmer newspaper, and they seized him and were obviously going to beat him to death. And Agent Sadel had to pull out his pistol and fight them off and get his prisoner back. And in return, at a later date when he was being interrogated, Stryker saw Steidl and remembered him and said, I've got something for you, with a small token and a small gift for saving my life. And he gave him his Bible. And the next slide, here is his Bible. And what he was, a lot of you may have seen him doing this in his cell. He would go through the Bible looking for passages that showed that the Bible was basically anti-Semitic, and it was certainly pornographic. And he'd get page after page marked. The next slide. And they looked like that. And he gave it to Agent Seidel, who was sitting right down here somewhere. He was.
Where is he?
Where is he? There he is. Well, in any case, the next slide. This is our third psychiatrist, Dr. Goldenson. Some of you may remember. Leon was a very severe, stern fellow. And he was just as Jewish as he could be. And Stryker took a great shine to him and embarrassed the life out of Leon. But Leon went out to the libraries in Nuremberg and got books that were being purged out of the local libraries, being written by the Nazis, and brought them back to the prison and had the prisoners inscribe them to him. In the next slide, here is the inscription in one of Stryker's own books, a very elaborate inscription to Dr. Goldenson. And I have several of these. And the next slide. Well, here was our prize exhibit, Goering, and after we'd gotten 100 pounds off him, so he looked fairly normal. But he's writing. Well, as you know, those who watched him, he wrote, much more than any of the other prisoners. And the next slide. The pen that he used in his cell is this one. Again, notice that the right-hand end of the cap is chewed off, like they all did. And strangely enough, this is a French fountain pen. It says Paris on it. He also had a very expensive gold Mont Blanc fountain pen in the baggage room, which he gave to one of the guards to persuade him to get out his face cream at the time he wanted to pick up his poison capsules. But this is the one he actually used. And the next slide. He also had had one of these. This is a two-ended automatic pencil with a red and blue crayon in it. And those of you that examine documents by Göring know that he signed a lot of them in a red or blue pencil like this. And this is what he used. At the time, in 1938, Hitler gave Eva Braun a fountain pen for Christmas. I have it in my pocket. I'll show you some of these things if you want later. And as soon as the other Nazis found out that Hitler was giving fountain pens, they all gave fountain pens. So this says on it, "We knocked in 1938, Hermann Göring." And he liked it so well that he kept a number of them to use. This particular one he gave to Keitel. But as I say, the pens were an interesting sidelight. The next slide. Well, another thing he brought with him that some of you probably saw was his huge suitcase. He had 17 suitcases to start with. This one was a beautiful leather suitcase with his name embossed on it. This was filled with the world's supply of paracodeine, which was made only in Germany then. And he would pour out 100 pills in the morning and eat them like peanuts all day. And you couldn't tell it made any difference with him until we got him off it. We got him off it just before we brought him to Nuremberg. And after that, he became brilliant. You know, in the courtroom, he was sharp as he could be, with no notes and no secretarial staff to look up data. And the farther we got him away from the codeine, the more he began to be more reasonable. I used to say, you know, when Hitler started to go to pieces at the end, why didn't you get rid of him? And like you did Rome. Well, you didn't do that. Well, the longer we got him away from the codeine, the more likely he was to agree that maybe he should have done something. Von Papen said to him, you know, Göring, you were the big war hero. We counted on you to take Hitler by the scruff of the neck and throw him out when he acted up, and you failed us. Well, I think it was the rosy glow of the codeine that kept him from doing anything good. And in any case, the next slide, again, some of you probably saw the, up at the top are his suitcases, like the one you saw. And the next slide. His lederhosen were enormous. He weighed 300 pounds. Next slide. Here was his hunting coat. He's standing over a stag at Karen Hall, a hunting lodge. And the next slide, I acquired that coat, and it's a big man's coat. It's that nice poplar or gray and white tweed, Bavarian tweed with a green silver or green velvet collar. But it's big enough to begin with, but on the sides there are expandable notches, so that no matter how fat he got, it would still fit him. And then the next slide. Well, let's go the other way. There we go. Now, if Hitler liked you, he'd give you this handsome silver frame of himself with his initials on. Well, Göring, of course, had a bigger one. So the next slide, Göring had this one made with a huge silver frame with his own coat of arms at the bottom. And the next slide, here it is on the table in his apartment in Berlin when he was entertaining Lindbergh and his wife. Lindbergh was sent over 3 times by our Air Force to find out if he could find what he could find out about their new fighter planes. And they let him fly the ME-109 when it was an early type. And I said, how did you dare fly this multi-million-dollar prototype with notoriously weak landing gear? He said, well, we'd been practicing with a similar one in case they would let me, and he did. And he gave us tremendously detailed reports about them. And the next slide. Well, here is the inventory of Göring's things in the baggage room. And his signature is over on the lower left. And it is signed by Jacques Wheelis, the man that let him into the baggage room to get at the poison that was in his face cream jar. And the upper arrow is pointing to the item of a watch, a stopwatch, which was in his possessions. Now, and actually, at the time this was signed by Wheelis, the next slide, Wheelis was wearing the watch. Oh, here's the watch. It's a beautiful piece of machinery. Again, I'll show it to you if you want to see it. I've got it in my pocket. But it has these little stopwatch dials so that you can navigate with it in the days before radio navigation. And the next slide. Here's Wheelis wearing it at the time he was signing that it was still in the baggage room. And the next slide. And he used Wheelis a lot. Here he's asking overweight Wheelis to give send 3,000 marks to his wife. So he was his go-between a good deal. And Wheelis accepted this role and performed it. And the next slide. And Gus Gilbert on the right, our psychologist, that again another Columbia man who was there, he swears that he knew that Goring was in the baggage room within 2 days before he committed suicide. And I don't doubt it for a minute. And there was nothing illegal about it. I mean, all he had to do was request his face cream, and they would get it for him. And he could dig out one of these capsules in this opaque face cream, and you'd never know it. And I'm sure that's what he did. And the next slide. Well, here is a note. The guards all signed affidavits swearing that nobody had even considered seeing or letting Goring in the baggage room. And yet here is a note from him asking for his blue notebook. And we all saw him in court with a blue notebook. So you knew he got in the baggage room when he wanted. He knew how to do it and did it. And the next slide. Well, here's what he was after. This is, again, I'll show you this if you'd like. There's a cut-off rifle cartridge case that they all carried their cyanide in. The one, he let us find one right away in his coffee crystal can so that we all relaxed. You know, we found it, no problem. Well, this one and another one were hidden in the jars of face cream in the baggage room, and this is the third ampule from his backup ampule that he wrote a sarcastic note about. We looked, we find it, and we emptied it out to test if it was cyanide. Indeed, it was. Well, there was talk that he hid this in his rectum. Well, this thing is not rectum compatible. The next slide will show you the ends of it. The neural ends are very irritating for the rectum. And you could get it in there, but you wouldn't be able to retain it very long, and your rectum would push it right out. And he was never asking for hemorrhoidal cream or anything like that. He was not hesitant to ask for medicines. He was always asking for headache pills or one thing or another. And only Hess asked for medicine more than Goring. Well, in any case, the rectal business is unimportant. I think the face cream gambit was perfectly logical. And he kept talking deliberately, talking about his skin trouble, both to me, to Kelly. Kelly wrote about it repeatedly. And I said, you don't have any skin trouble. Well, he did at first. He was so fat that his thighs rubbed together. But he got that cleaned up very quickly when he lost the weight. And after that, he had no skin trouble. I said, what are you talking about? You don't have any skin trouble. Well, he said, the reason is that I take such good care of it with my skin cream. Well, that was logical. And, you know, the poor devil was going to be hanged. There was nothing that seemed wrong about letting him have his face cream. So I think he was just very cleverly building up this arrangement to get at it. And he did. And the next slide. Well, here's the hangman. A few of you may have met this charming gentleman. And the old Colonel Andrews said there's going to be no souvenirs from this hanging. You know, we got an offer of $25,000 for the rope that hanged Goring, and he said, absolutely not. I want both ends of the rope burned in the coffin with each body. Well, they were, except that the hangman defeated Andrus again. He cut off a 2-inch souvenir segment before he made the nooses. And the next slide, here's the one from Stryker's rope, and the next slide, one from Frick's rope. So I have them all if you want to see them. In any case, these were indeed kept. Well, finally, the next slide. Here is old Hitler. Now, Hitler was dying of Parkinson's disease. He probably had encephalitis in World War I, the end of World War I, and after that, you're likely to get a very galloping form of Parkinson's, and his left hand began to tremble so badly that his image of invulnerability was destroyed. And if he gripped something in his left hand, the tremor disappeared. And here you see him gripping something. If you look at his pictures after 1940, he's always gripping something or holding his left hand with his right or having it in his pocket. And he was going downhill very fast. And the next slide, and they kept it from the country. Well, one of his statements was he was loved by his people. He didn't have to carry a gun. Well, he did, the rascal. He had, every time he got a new pair of trousers like this one, he took it to the tailor and had the pocket replaced with a leather pocket. Any of you that have carried a pistol in your pocket know that serrations on the front sight cut a hole in your pocket very quickly. Well, this was at the tailor's having this done. Is the only reason it get burned. And the next slide. And here he is dancing his jig at the surrender of France, but notice he's holding something in his left hand again so it won't jiggle. And it was getting worse. The next slide. And another way he kept it still, he hooked his thumb in his belt. Well, they all saw him doing it, so they all did it. Well, he was doing it to keep his hand from jiggling. And the next slide. Well, another, you know, he killed himself, and his men burned his body, pretty much, but the Russians dug it up. And you always wonder, how do you know it was really him? Well, these are on the upper right are the x-rays that we had at Nuremberg. And notice that on your right, the sinus in his cheekbone, the antrum, is cloudy. On the other side is clear. He was having an attack of sinusitis. That's why this picture was taken. But notice his bridge work, his gold bridge work. Look at the lower right. And notice the upper left tooth is a frame of gold with a thin layer of porcelain on the front. So it looks very obvious. And if you look at the photograph of him on the upper left, you'll see that his upper left incisor is a different color from the rest of his teeth. I had quite a time finding any picture of him smiling, because he rarely did because of that. On the lower right, you see that ring-shaped device on the lower right. That is also obvious on the x-ray. So it was him, all right, that the Russians dug up. And finally, the next slide. This is the chair in which he was shot, or shot himself, and that's his blood down on the left, and well, actually in the center. So now in the future, if any of you want a DNA typing of Hitler's blood, we can make it available. But let me wind up the next slide by expressing our thanks to our leader, and Rex, we really appreciate it.
John Lattimer gets better every reunion, so at the next reunion 5 years from now, we're going to have him back again. Thank you, John. We now have some slides that are going to be shown us by Carolyn Tebo, who is a faithful worker at the U.S. Holocaust Museum. She's head of the Speakers Bureau there. And she has some slides which she's going to put on, which I haven't seen. And do you need this?
Well, it's my pleasure to be here representing the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. As you know, the museum opened to the public in April of 1993. There are many museums in Washington, but this museum is very different from any of them. This museum is a memorial to events so terrible and destructive that they are known simply as the Holocaust. The Holocaust was a systematic and state-sponsored extermination of 6 million Jews and millions of other Nazi victims in World War II. The mission of the museum is to confront the Holocaust, to tell what happened during that terrible time, to seek answers to the many questions that still remain unanswered more than half a century after the dreadful events took place, to remember, and most important, to learn. One of the Nazi concentration camps was Auschwitz. Over 50 years ago, the Nazis began to systematically imprison, starve, and murder millions of people. This is the death camp today. With time, the stark outlines of the barracks have begun to blur. The grass grows green here now, but still, visitors say, the birds do not sing. After touring the camps, columnist George Will wrote, "The earth here is unquiet. All that are here are memorials and ashes and boxes and a silence." That silence at Auschwitz is echoed at Treblinka and Dachau, and the other Nazi concentration camps. Looking at the camps today, it's difficult to comprehend the horror that happened here. With time, memories fade and the silence grows. But we need to break the silence and remember the Holocaust. As Americans, we need to learn the lessons the Holocaust has to teach for all who cherish freedom. Americans now have a place to confront the questions raised by the Holocaust and a place to seek their answers. That place is the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Chartered by Congress, the museum has been built through private donations raised through a national fundraising campaign. Tens of thousands of people, survivors, liberators, volunteers, students, members of churches and synagogues, concerned business people, all have contributed to the creation of this unique national institution. The building is on federal land, just 400 yards away from the Washington Monument in our nation's capital. It is just across the tidal basin from the National Memorial to Thomas Jefferson, who wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and endowed with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The other memorials on the mall celebrate democratic principles. This museum reminds us of how they can fail. When you first see the museum from the street, it may seem familiar, in keeping with the buildings nearby. Once you step inside, you will know immediately that you are in a different place. Disturbing, evocative, with towers that echo the watchtowers of the camps. This atrium space is the Hall of Witness. The Hall of Witness is centrally located on the first floor. From this area, one can go to the left or right, up or down with various choices, a reminder of the lack of choices for the victims of the Holocaust. When you take the elevator to the permanent exhibition, you will witness the nightmarish efficiency and unparalleled human tragedy of the Holocaust. The horrific story is brought to life in many ways. Through pictures and films taken by Nazis, prisoners, and liberators, one can visualize graphic depictions of the horrifying events that took place. Through the recollections of survivors and liberators, gathered, filmed, taped, and archived by museum staff, and through the thousands of everyday objects and major artifacts donated to the museum, you will witness the full scope of the Holocaust, from the initial persecution of German Jews to the torture and despair of the camps. You can identify with the Holocaust from a more individual, personal perspective through an ID card received as you enter the exhibition. Each card has the name and photo of a person who experienced the Holocaust. Your learning of the Holocaust begins where it began for many American soldiers in World War II. Suddenly, like the American liberators in 1945, you are seeing things no human eyes should ever see. Evidence of starvation and torture, evidence so stark, so tragic, that General Dwight Eisenhower wrote that it beggared description. As you look at photos taken during the liberation of the camps, you have to wonder, as the Americans did then, how could human beings come to this? To search for answers to your question, the museum takes you further back in time. This journey into darkness begins in 1933 with ordinary people, people like us. Photographs from pre-Nazi Europe depict the vital Jewish culture that existed then. The museum tells the story of gypsies and other persecuted victims who, along with the Jews, were targeted for extermination by the Nazis. The pieces of this gypsy costume were brought together by the museum staff from communities throughout Eastern Europe. You see what happens as the Nazis gain power in Germany in 1933 and start their systematic persecution. The change begins almost at once. Some Jews were forced to wear special badges. Their shops and businesses were forced out of their shops and stores were forced out of business. A propaganda campaign of hate began. Then, November 1938, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Throughout Germany, synagogues, Jewish businesses, and even homes were looted, ransacked, and gutted by fires. Jews were arrested and killed. Charred prayer books found near Gießen and donated to the museum bear mute witness to that horrible night. After Kristallnacht, you move still further into the story of the Holocaust. In September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. A year later, the whole world was at war. And like the hundreds of thousands of Jews who were driven into confinement, you cross into a world of ghettos cut off from the world outside. Bridges like this one were constructed for the Jews to walk over the streets so they would have no contact with the passengers of the trolley line. Cut off from the cities outside, Jews were forced to live in terribly crowded conditions with hardly any food. Many died from starvation or illness. In the ghetto section of the museum, you will see a casting of this wall, the last remaining wall of the Warsaw Ghetto. Another reminder of ghetto life is this 15 by 34-inch model of the Lodz Ghetto made by Leon Jacobson during the 4 years he was held there. When Mr. Jacobson learned he was to be deported, he buried the model beneath the basement of his apartment building, and later, after the war, it was found. Now, the next chapter of the story begins to unfold. The Nazis begin their so-called final solution to the problem of what to do with the Jews. Mass deportations from the ghettos are instituted, and as you leave the ghetto, you can enter one of the museum's most powerful artifacts, Railroad Car 31599G, the same model used to transport Jews from Warsaw to the extermination camp at Treblinka. When the deportations began, people didn't know where they were being sent. The Nazis ordered them to bring their belongings, and so with hope, they packed their suitcases with small household items, toothbrushes, prayer shawls, and shoes, possessions confiscated by the Nazis once the trains arrived at the camps. Many of these objects can be seen in the museum, the true end of the journey, the camps. Here, millions of people were selected and processed, enslaved and murdered. At the entrance to Auschwitz, there was a gate, ironically inscribed in German, "Work will make you free." But of course, most who came to Auschwitz would never leave. You too will pass under this gate, a direct casting from the original. As they arrived at the camps, the prisoners were given a quick inspection and selected for work or for death. If you lived, you were given a bowl to eat from and a uniform to wear. Special patches on your uniform identified your group or nationality. Jews, the people systematically targeted for destruction everywhere, wore yellow stars. But there were other persecuted groups as well. Political prisoners and Polish Catholics wore red triangles, homosexuals pink triangles, and Jehovah's Witnesses purple triangles. Gypsies were given black or brown triangles. There are thousands of artifacts that are testaments to the Nazis' efficiency in practicing genocide. One such group of artifacts are the canisters of Zyklon B, the pesticide which the cost-conscious Nazis used for mass killings, because studies show that gas was more efficient than bullets. And these medical instruments used in human experiments in Sachsenhausen. Similar instruments were used at a number of hospitals that participated in the Nazis' euthanasia program, set up to murder those deemed physically and mentally unfit. These early victims of the Nazis were mostly Aryan Germans. Another testament to the Nazis' efficiency is this forerunner of today's computer. It's an IBM Hollerith punch card tabulating machine. It was used during Nazi census throughout the 30s to aid in identifying Jews and Gypsies for destruction. These are only a few of the more than 35,000 objects that the museum has collected to help tell its story. Many of these objects have been donated by survivors, rescuers, or liberators. In some cases, special agreements were negotiated with foreign governments to acquire them. Other major artifacts include this building that was once a woman's barracks at Birkenau. As you stand inside it, you can begin to get a sense of what daily life on the edge of death was like. As you continue past the exhibit on camp life, you come to these shoes of victims from Adonis. The poem above the shoes reads, "We are the children, we are the last witnesses. We are the shoes from grandchildren and grandfathers, from Prague, Paris, and Amsterdam. And because we are only made of fabric and leather, and not of blood and flesh, each one of us avoided the hellfire." And there are other kinds of records. Records left by the thousands of Nazi officials it took to make the Holocaust happen. With their countless lists and schedules and requisition forms, an efficient bureaucracy of genocide began. The enormity of what the Nazis accomplished is brought home with special poignancy when you see the three-story Tower of Faces. Its walls are covered with 1,500 photographs, the faces of the Jews from Ashiski, a town in what is now Lithuania. All but 29 of the 3,500 people were shot to death on September 24, 1941 by the Nazi Mobile Killing Squad. And that was just one day, one village. Altogether, there were 6,000 towns and villages in which such killings took place in 1,200 days of killing. As you think about the millions who died, you have to wonder about the millions more who stood by and did nothing while their neighbors were taken away to exile and death. But the museum also reminds you of the others, those few who helped. You will see this fishing boat, one of several used to ferry Denmark's Jews to safety in neutral Sweden. Under cover of darkness, more than 90% of Denmark's Jews were saved. And this Bible, from which Pastor André Trocny preached to the villagers of Le Chambeau in occupied France as he led them in hiding hundreds of Jewish children. While these events were taking place in Europe, what was happening in the United States? You will also see the Holocaust from the American perspective. See what this country knew about what was going on and what we chose to ignore. There were accurate stories printed, but accurate reporting did not change American foreign and immigration policy. A rigid U.S. immigration policy kept thousands of desperate refugees away from our shores, including the passengers of the SS St. Louis, who came all the way across the Atlantic seeking safety, and then were refused entry and forced to return. Many of those passengers were later sent to camps. Few survived. You will see the aerial photographs of Auschwitz taken by the U.S. 15th Army Air Force on its way to bomb factories only 5 miles away. The U.S. War Department refused to bomb the railroad tracks to Auschwitz. What would have been the effect if they had done so? And then you will see another side to the American story, the saga of American involvement in liberating the camps and helping the survivors begin their return to life. We now move on to the final chapter of the Holocaust story. Many of the Nazi perpetrators were placed on trial and punished for their crimes. Photographs from the trials offer an opportunity to see the human face behind the machinery of death. The survivors went on to try and rebuild their lives away from Europe, in the United States and in Israel. At this point, you will emerge from the exhibition, but with the story of the Holocaust still with you. Before you leave the museum, you will probably need a little more time to reflect on what you have just experienced. And so you may enter the Hall of Remembrance, America's national memorial to the victims of the Holocaust, a luminous spiritual place, a place for contemplation. It is one, and then we have a part of the mandation for a child's exhibit. It is one of the first of the major Holocaust exhibits ever assembled that is for and about children. It uses film, photos, recreated environments, and participatory activities to depict the events of the 30s and 40s. The basic theme is that underlies the Remembrance the Children exhibit is listen to the story, remember the story, and tell the story to future generations. Perhaps we can best see how these aims work together by looking at one special wall of the museum, the Children's Wall of Remembrance. The wall consists of approximately 3,300 ceramic tiles chosen from 30,000 tiles, hand-painted by American school children after completing a study unit on the Holocaust. Tiles painted in memory of the nearly 1.5 million children who were murdered. The tiles reflect the understanding the children have gained from studying the Holocaust, their grief for the past, but with it their hope for their future, and the future of all humankind. And of course, that is the basic theme of the Holocaust Museum itself. I have one more. Right now, thanks to the remembrance and assistance of tens of thousands of people, donors of stories and artifacts, time and money, this important storytelling museum exists. It is a place of remembrance, a place of knowledge, but above all, a place of education for us and for future generations.
Many of us have seen many of those pictures from some of the documents and photographs that came out of Nuremberg before. The Holocaust Museum has certainly done a magnificent job, and a number of you are going to be visiting the Holocaust Museum who haven't seen it before on Sunday, and we're very delighted that that can be made a part of in the way of this reunion, an extension of it. One of the important things, of course, is how do we get the message across to people around the country about what happened in connection with the Holocaust and the murder of so many Jews, Gypsies, and others, as you saw during this presentation. And a organization called Facing History and Ourselves. Facing ourselves, why did this happen? What are we going to do about the fact that it did happen? And that we want to have an influence in the future to see that these kinds of atrocities lessen or do not happen again. One of the organizations that's done most in that connection is Facing History and Ourselves. And we're very fortunate to have here Margot Strom, who many years ago, 10 years ago, to my knowledge, held conferences on the Nuremberg and has since stimulated across the country the holding of teaching, the holding of many conferences as well as many teaching instruction arrangements concerning the Holocaust. It's a delight for me to introduce Margot Strom.
Get the lights put on, please. Sure. How about putting the lights on?
There's a request for lights. Very good. Very typical.
I'll ask my brother, who's come to hear me, to tell me when 15 minutes is up. And Drexel said he would do it as well. Mary Johnson, you can do it. I would like to acknowledge, if I may, and y'all are going to be doing it anyway, but I need to do it from the voices of the teachers and the students across this country and in Europe who've been at Facing History workshops and conferences. A very special thank you to Telford Taylor, who served on our board since the beginning of Facing History, spoke at that conference that Drexel spoke about. I'd like to thank Walter Rockman for being at our conference, and Ben Ferenz, who continues to. There's Ben way in the back, and y'all know him, and you're going to hear him again. He inspires teachers over and over again, year after year, with some of the most extraordinary and wonderful stories about your history, but also some very profound and disturbing messages to our teachers, and it provokes them truly to go back and think about what they have been teaching and forgetting to teach. And so I thank you, Ben, and also thank you for helping to write the materials that Facing History uses in its book. Thank you. I need to mention that also a thanks to John Freed. Did any of you remember John Freed by any chance? Ben does. Good. This is a man who helped write Facing History's first materials on Nuremberg, and the reason we had to go to him is because a student asked in one of the first Facing History classes when we were beginning to teach about the Holocaust so many years ago. Her name was Lisa Krakow. She's now a Harvard Law School graduate working on job discrimination law and will speak at Facing History's 20th anniversary dinner. But in my class, she of course asked the adolescent question, which was, who's to blame? Who's responsible? How do you make judgment about this history? At that time, we didn't quite have that chapter yet. We had a chapter that began with questions of identity and membership. We now use the work of Martha Meadow at Harvard Law School, who's planning our next conference, which will be about judgment in April of 1997, to help us think about questions of membership in the universe of obligation and how to teach adolescents and their teachers how to get involved in thinking about the issues that they need to think about in terms of decision-making and morality before they begin to look at the history that happened for 20 years when the democracy failed in Nazi Germany before the Holocaust. Facing History is very much moral education. It goes about teaching teachers to first think about their own thinking. They do that in journals. They do that first after their teachers have done it in workshops and institute with scholars. They think about their own thinking for the first time, and then they begin to do that in public space. Civic space, as Benjamin Barber calls it, the civic virtue of democracy and sharing their thinking with other people. Traditionally, American classrooms have become very vocal. Everyone gets a chance to speak. Teachers think they've done a very good job, but the reality is students are often echoing or mimicking the ideas of their parents. They're marching in someone else's parade. Often adolescent children haven't thought deeply about their own thoughts. And so one of the tasks in a facing history classroom is to ask them to reserve judgment, reserve their opinion, and really begin to walk in someone else's shoes. As you know, Hannah Arendt, the woman who is tremendously controversial and has caused a lot of us to think deeply about what it means to be involved in analyzing this history, the politics of this history, as well as its pitfalls. She suggested when she sat at Eichmann's trial so many years after the work you all did, that what she saw there was the ultimate Socratic evil, and she called it thoughtlessness. And she then raised this question that she wrote about in her memoirs. She said, could we get people to abstain from evil if we could get them to think about thinking, if we could get them to walk in someone else's shoes? If you hold that question up as you begin to read the documents that you used at Nuremberg, listen to the testimony at Nuremberg, listen to the testimony of the Auschwitz trial in the 1960s, of Eichmann's trial, listen to the people now who are beginning to share their memories. Listen to Speer. Look at Gina Sereni's new book. You really begin to read about how people suppressed thinking, how they didn't want to put themselves in anyone else's shoes, how empathy was dangerous. It was too easy to be obedient, to follow the charismatic, to find the parade, to lose your identity. But if you began to think and you had empathy and you walked in someone else's shoes, it was too painful. In fact, Phyllis Schlafly, who says Holocaust education is dangerous to American students, suggests that it's dangerous because it asks kids to think. I also would like to propose to you another thought that happened on a research project on facing history in a private school outside of Boston. Children there looked at facing history and said to their teacher, "This is interesting. Does it count? How do you get an A in this?" Well, there are real questions about how do you judge one's performance as you're struggling with such complex issues, such painful history, such a history of the betrayal of adults, of doctors and lawyers, moms and dads and teachers, all the figures of authority that adolescent students are learning that they are to trust and work with as they begin to build community. And so in some sense, maybe those who are afraid of education about the Holocaust are right. Maybe it's too dangerous to think. Because what was found in this school is that children who were adolescents on their way to schools like Harvard and other places were thinking to the point that they froze their sense of outrage. They could put themselves in everyone's position. They could out-analyze, out-think, out-inform, give you more dates. But when it came to a simple sense of outrage, the feeling you would have at seeing the hair that has been collected at the Holocaust Museum, at hearing the stories of Holocaust survivors, of just being able to say, as Nahama Tek said, the people who saved her in Poland, who didn't necessarily like Jews, did it because they were of their own conscience. They were of their own sense of morality. Despite their church, despite their neighborhood, despite their nation, there was a sense of outrage. When you look to this history to find the very little, but there is a stream of those people who showed resistance and courage in times of prevention, in times of choice, not when terror meant the decision between feeding your child and someone else's, not when it meant making a decision that lost your life. But when you look for the streams of those people who were able to make a difference, who did speak out, who were able to save someone's life, that simple sense of outrage, that simple sense of courage, that simple sense of morality they describe is really not so complex. It is that simple. So as much as we want people to think, to have empathy, to walk in someone else's shoes, see the world through someone else's lens, that you need. But the opposite of that is don't go too far so that you wipe out, with too much analysis, the simple outrage one should have at looking at injustice. We can't get too desensitized to this violence that you all just saw in the slides. I want to mention something. As I drove here, a man let me out of the car, and someone else quickly whisked my suitcase away, and he said, "What are you here for? Are you checking in?" And I said, "No, I'm here for a meeting." He said, "Are you here for the in meeting?" I said, "What?" "The in meeting." I thought he meant I-N. No, he meant your meeting, in. He says, "Well, I don't know how to pronounce it." Well, I stopped right on the sidewalk and I began a lesson on Nuremberg. He wasn't interested. He was rushing to open the door. I stayed with him. I said, "Nuremberg, let me tell you about it." But by the time I was ready to do that, he had moved on to his job. So I guess Facing History needs truly to capture these future students in the classroom before they become the people who come to take our suitcases. But y'all have a lot of work to do, because if you think that adults in our classrooms today know anything about this history, you truly are wrong. There is a tremendous silence, a tremendous vacuum. Some teachers feel it's blasphemous to teach this history. Some feel it's too controversial, it's too difficult. I don't want to teach about Jews. Can we teach it without mentioning Jews? Night and Fog, the great film about this history, never mentions the word Jew. There is so much trepidation on the part of teachers now, saying, for example, in my hometown in Memphis, the whole Senate just voted, except for one senator, to post the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments. That's not the Bill of Rights. That's the 10 Commandments. It's still dangerous for teachers to teach about evolution in Memphis. Teachers who want to teach about Facing History say, "Well, could you help me? Can you walk with me? Can you teach the lesson for me? Can you go to my PTO meeting for me?" Facing History is here all over the country to do that, to teach teachers, to teach them with the scholars. I want to mention the man Persipico, whose newest book about Nuremberg you all were talking about earlier. He has a story about Bill Jackson's father. You're going to hear from Bill Jackson later. Not the ones that Senator Dodd mentioned, but an interesting story. He said on the day that Jackson was driving, some of you all read this book, on the day he was driving to do the prosecution summary, he was talking to his driver, and his driver was an engineer from an American school and was planning to go back to be a draftsman. Except the driver said, "Since I've been here with you, something has transformed me. I've had an awakening. I've had a transformation. I can't just take this information in and see myself going back to be at the draftsman's table. Instead," he said, "I've decided to be a priest." Well, Facing History is not real interested altogether in teaching this history so we transform people to become priests, but we are interested in their meditation. Jackson said, supposedly, "It is what you tell me, it is that power of that moral transformation that I want to happen as a legacy of this trial." And I think when you teach about what you all have done at Nuremberg and you bring it into a classroom, you have allowed students to come in to think about obedience and conformity, rights and responsibilities, to make judgment finally. They've reserved it throughout the course, and then finally they're ready to sit and make judgment. They want you to help them answer the question, who is responsible? They want to know, and this is the adolescent question, do evil people get punished? They want to know, how can we talk never again when things are happening as they are throughout this world? I want to tell you where the hope comes from in class. It really comes from you, Ben Ferenz. When Ben Ferenz speaks about the International World Courts, Drinan will speak to you about it. 15 years ago, we spoke about it. There is a hope. It takes a long time. People weren't ready to hear about the Holocaust for so many years. People really weren't ready for the drama and the theater of Nuremberg, or its precedents and its legacies. As one survivor said, we were too busy surviving. We had to get our lives ready. People are just ready for Nuremberg now. We can't measure time in the lifespan of one's life. People learn about history years and years and years and generations after the event. So we have to begin to study those legacies and tell them. I know someone's here from Shoah to ask you all to give them your testimony. You have no idea how important it is that you enable us and ennoble us as teachers to carry on the stories that you all have about this history. all of the texture that you can give us, in addition to the rule of law and the differences you can point out about the precedents that you built on and the legacies that you left in terms of legal terms, we need to tell people also that the people that you tried were human beings. Because so often students come into class and they say, don't worry, that can't happen here. Hitler's dead. We have the Bill of Rights. And they may mean, of course, the same thing can't happen again. But they don't mean that. They just mean the adults will protect us. This is the time where children learn this history, and they have to balance this new emerging notion about the complexity of human behavior. The adults didn't protect the children. They indoctrinated the children in Nazi Germany. The adults used children for 20 years to march in their parades, read Erich Mann, read the lesson plans that children had in classrooms, read Gregor Zeimer's report of what was happening in the classrooms, learn how children learn to hate because it is easily taught. Children begin to say, wait a minute, how could the doctors have sterilized Christian women who were colorblind because they did not want to have a colorblind Aryan? And then how could that precedent from the eugenics movement in the United States, the sterilization laws in the United States, how could the theologians who preached in the 1920s and the eugenicists who preached in the 1920s raise science for this country? How could those words have been used by lawyers in Nazi Germany and judges? Where were the teachers joining the Nazi Party in such unbelievable numbers? This history is a history of the betrayal of children. So indeed, it is dangerous, because when you do teach it, you can bet, if you want to teach about social justice, that children will begin to feel discomfort, disequilibrium. They're going to begin to ask questions that are hard, and a lot of teachers don't have the answers. We don't want to mire children in relativism. Not everything is equal. There is an evil to this history. It's wrong. But at the same time, you have to let students discuss, debate, give their points of view. And when you open American classrooms to real debate, you hear very terrible things. You hear innocent questions. They're okay. When a child asks Father Bullock, the Catholic priest, does a hole open in the confession booth when you tell a lie and you fall through? Father Bullock goes, my goodness, where did you get that? And the next child in the same class say, did Jews have horns? Where did you get that? Did Jews kill Christ? Where did you get that? After 3 questions, the teacher's freezing in class, petrified, ready to close the door, fearful the principal will come in, afraid the parents will hear. Hear what? Questioning? A priest to have a discussion with children? Is that breaking church and state? And yet teacher thinks it may. So I just want to suggest to you what a difficult, complex problem it is to educate America's teachers about this most profound and important history. And I want to elicit your help in helping us. I want to end, if I might, with 2 things. One is the other question children ask besides who is responsible, and what could I have done. It's the one that happens when you all wrote about Streicher. And we quoted about the power of words, about the power to dehumanize and make enemy of someone, to change a human to a vermin, to a bacilli, so that you see that human being as dangerous to your own child, so that you can kill so ruthlessly as Jews, gypsies, and others were so killed in this genocide. So I am always reminded of this notion of the moral backbone of a citizenry, and I want to think about how can we prevent our children from turning against one another. How can we make sure that our democracy is strong? This is a letter that a teacher gets at the beginning of, you may have heard it, at school. A principal puts this in the mailbox of teachers years ago. Do y'all remember who Chaim Ginott was? G-I-N-O-T? A lot of parents remember because he wrote Parent and Child. Wonderful book. He quotes this letter, and if we could do nothing else in classrooms across this country, I would teach about Nuremberg, lock, stock, and barrel. Hottenbach at City University of New York says doctors aren't teaching it in this country. Martha Menow, a law professor at Harvard, says Nuremberg is not taught there. Alan Ryan, after our conference, started teaching it at Boston College. Theologians don't learn about it. There is no legacy yet, systematically, to teach this history. So, this principal puts this letter in his box. of every teacher. Dear teacher, I am a survivor of a concentration camp. My eyes saw what no man should witness. Gas chambers built by learned engineers, children poisoned by educated physicians, infants killed by trained nurses, women and babies shot and burned by high school and college graduates. So I am suspicious of education. My request is, help your students become human. Your efforts must never produce learned monsters, skilled psychopaths, educated Eichmanns. Reading, writing, and arithmetic are important only if they serve to make our children more human. What better rationale for teaching about this history? Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have a break.
Justice Jackson assembled his trial staff primarily from lawyers in the military service. He didn't have the luxury of just calling upon the members of a large law firm and say, well, we'll all go over to Nuremberg and try this lawsuit. He had to put together his staff from people that he could find any place in the government or elsewhere. Most of us were in the service, and most of us were in the Army, such as Drex and these big shots, but there were a few of us in the Navy, and I think there were only 3 of us actually in the Navy. One of them, Walter Brudenell, was an enlisted man, and you all know Walter died a couple of years ago. Many of these individuals who were selected to participate in the trial were ambitious men and sought distinctive roles in the proceedings. Justice Jackson really needed to find one person upon whom he could absolutely rely, who would be his aid and confidant throughout the trial. And it just happened that he knew a young man at that time, had just graduated from law school, and was an ensign in the Navy. I was happy to know that. And who was that but his son, Bill Jackson. So Bill came over, you know, as really as to be his father's aide. But it didn't take about 2 weeks before Bill Jackson emerged as one of the real contributors to the legal staff. He assisted his father in cross-examination of witnesses and in the making of speeches and arguments. And I remember his participation in helping his father actually write some speeches. As a matter of fact, Bill, I can recall now when there were a group of us together there, when we were working on the final address to the tribunal, and we were trying to define descriptive words of each of the accused, what we would call them. And there was, I remember your contribution in one case was it Seisenfeld? I don't know who it was. It said, and their explanation always was, you know, well, we had the office, but we didn't have the power. We were just carrying out orders. So Bill came up with the thing, well, he reigned but did not rule. Remember that, Bill? Yeah. Who was that? I don't know. Anyway, Bill Jackson made a tremendous contribution at Nuremberg. He was really one of the great lawyers on our staff, and he stuck throughout the trial, and he was just a tower of strength to his father. I really don't think that Justice Jackson could have had the tremendous success that he had at Nuremberg without the loyal and effective work of his son, Bill Jackson. And Bill, I would like you to take off now and tell us, in your own words, what we really did there in Nuremberg. Bill Jackson.
Thank you, Whitney.
think, well, what you didn't put it quite so bluntly, what he really wants to know is what the hell Jackson Jr. was doing at Nuremberg. Let me start briefly with the background of the trial. You all, of course, remember the debate that was going on in early 1945 with respect to the punishment of the Nazi leaders, whether it should be by summary execution or by trial. And as you know, Mr. Churchill and Mr. Stalin were for summary execution, as was our Secretary of State, Mr. Polk. But the President, Franklin Roosevelt, was uncommitted. In April of that year, my father made a speech to the American Society of International Law, in which he said, in essence, if the Nazi leaders are to be executed, it must be by military or political decision, not involving the judicial system. But if they are to be tried, it must be a real trial on evidence of complicity, and a fair trial in which the accused may defend themselves so that only the right men are convicted and for the right reason. This reasoning apparently persuaded President Roosevelt and his counsel, Judge Rosenman, who, with the aid of Harry Hopkins, started out to try to convert the British. After Mr. Truman succeeded Mr. Roosevelt, he and Judge Rosenman sounded out my father in May of 1945 about being appointed as the representative of the United States to negotiate an agreement for an international trial and also to prosecute the case on behalf of the United States. My father was concerned about his duties as a justice of the court. He thought it was essential that he should return by the first Monday in October so that his absence would not affect the normal functioning of the court. Judge Rosenman said, look, the United States has all the major prisoners. The War Department has volumes of documents. The trial should be short, and the justice can return to court in October. Judge Rosenman undoubtedly believed this to be so, but as you all know, it was a monumental overstatement. There were loads of documents, yes, but they were untranslated, they were undigested, they were unanalyzed, and the work had hardly begun. In any event, my father accepted and got to work, including the recruiting of the staff. He invited me to join the team as his personal assistant. I was only recently admitted to the bar, and this was my first case. I was obviously not chosen for proven legal ability, although my father was not disappointed that I had been an editor of the Harvard Law Review. And I didn't need a job. I had one. I was a naval officer assigned to the Bureau of Ships. I think I was chosen because I was familiar with his ways of working and thinking and deciding. Someone he could trust to handle details and implement the performance of courses and initiatives that he had decided upon. To be his competent and right hand, but not his alter ego. My first assignment was to assist in the four-power negotiations for agreement on an international tribunal to try the principal Nazi government leaders. The conference began at Church House in the bombed-out city of London. at the end of June 1945. I attended the conference throughout until agreement was reached in early August. Of course, my father had other advisors, but I contributed what I could to his efforts to convince the other delegations on various points of disagreement. These included the planning and conduct of aggressive war as a war crime. This was the cornerstone of his position in those negotiations. Also, the need to define aggression and the ingredients of a common plan and conspiracy. In addition to this, there was the drafting and redrafting of proposed protocols or agreements and amendments regarding the trial, and study, analysis, and comments on drafts circulated by other delegations. Throughout, the other three delegations were in no hurry. The Soviet group delayed the beginning of the meetings by being several days late in arriving, and later they refused my father's invitation to visit Nuremberg as a possible site of the trial, which necessitated a second visit at their convenience. But my father was infused with a sense of urgency. Unlike his counterparts, he was not only a negotiator of the agreement, but also the chief prosecutor for the United States. The three other countries had not appointed prosecutors. My father goaded them to get on with the job so that the trial preparations could proceed. He noted with emphasis that the Americans had the most prominent prisoners, were busily collecting evidence, and that they would go it alone if the others did not move quickly. With the agreement and charter finally agreed upon and signed, the next event was the selection of documents and the drafting of an indictment. The Soviet delegation wanted to charge the Germans with the massacre of 11,000 Polish officers who were prisoners of war in the forest of Katyn near Smolensk. My father had been informed that the massacre was carried out by the Soviets, not by the Germans, and sent me to the War Department in Washington to find out what evidence military intelligence had on this matter. And I was able to report that G2 was satisfied from forensic and other evidence that the crime had been committed at a time when Soviet troops had control of the area. Based on this information, my father refused to charge the crime against the Germans, and heated discussions with the Soviets took place. Finally, a compromise was reached. The charge was phrased in the passive voice. 11,000 prisoners of war were killed. And my father advised the Soviets that the United States would have nothing to do with this matter, but would expect the Soviets to produce whatever evidence they had. The tribunal did not decide the issue, but a few years ago, a new Russian Federation admitted that the crime was carried out by the Soviet troops. During the trial preparation, I was given other assignments. The tip had been received that important documents might be found in Goering's hunting lodge near Bad Reichenau. Roger Barrett and I were dispatched to take a look. We were met at the door by Frau Goering, who very politely gave permission to search. We searched the house from stem to gudgeon, and what we found in the attic was great hordes of cases of cognac and French champagne, Cuban cigars, and Lucky Strike green cigarettes. Remember, Lucky Strike green had gone to war, which unfortunately were evidence of nothing but Mr. Goering's acquisitive gluttony. Also, my father was concerned about delays in the proceedings if all the questions and answers and arguments had to be translated consecutively in 3 other languages. He had heard of experiments in simultaneous translation carried on at the League of Nations in Geneva. I was sent to Geneva to reconnoiter. And while there, I was referred to Washington. In Washington, I explained the problem to Charlie Horsky, who was in charge of the prosecution's Washington office. Charlie took it up with IBM, and the rest is history. A simultaneous translation system with skilled staff was in place at the opening of trial, without which the trial would have taken at least 3 or 4 times as long. From time to time during the course of the trial, I also carried messages from my father to President Truman, mostly regarding difficulties with the Soviets, which my father thought the President should be aware of in the conduct of U.S. foreign policy during the beginning of the Cold War. My father also flattered me by consulting me on questions of policy and strategy. What did I think of his disagreement with General Donovan with regard to whether the evidence should be based on the testimony of witnesses or on documents? Not surprisingly, I agreed with his position that documents were a firmer foundation. You can't cross-examine a document. What about proposals for plea bargains? There were several such proposals. The principal one involving Goering and Schacht. General Donovan had a German lawyer named Leverkusen from Hamburg come to Nuremberg. This lawyer communicated between the general and the Germans' defendants' counsel. In that way, a proposition came to my father that Schacht would testify against Goering. Goering, we knew, was ready to testify against Schacht. Goering wanted an understanding that if he was convicted, he would be shot and not hanged. He candidly, at that stage, didn't see much chance of his escape. Donovan's idea was that Schacht should be permitted to testify against Goering, and in that way, work himself out of the case if he could. My father didn't feel that we should have any bargains with any defendants. He thought we had evidence enough to convict them without it. He thought that any bargain by which we used any one of them to convict the other would always give the impression of a deal back of the scenes and would raise questions as to the integrity of the process. My father preferred that some get away, if they were going to get away, without any bargains about it. So he turned down the proposition of a deal. Now, let me turn to the preparation of my father's opening the address to the tribunal, about which you heard earlier today. I think it's fair to say that my father was one of the best educated public servants of his generation. And this was largely the result of self-education. He read avidly and widely. Bible, Shakespeare, other classics, and he practiced Emerson's ideal of self-reliance. Throughout his career as Assistant Attorney General, Solicitor General, Attorney General, and Justice, he never used a ghostwriter. Though he relied on his staff for help in checking facts and law, in which I played a small part, the ideas were of his own creation. And he always wrote his own stuff with a yellow pad and pencil or by dictation, followed by drafting and redrafting. His method and his problems are best revealed in his own words, as set forth in his memoir given to the Columbia University Oral History Project. And now I'm quoting from his memoir. The prosecutors had agreed on the division of the case and on the order of presentation. The Americans were to open the overall case on conspiracy at the beginning of the trial. That put considerable burden on us because it required us to be the earliest ready with the biggest portion of the case. The British would make an opening speech and follow with the presentation of their evidence, then the French, and then the Soviets. This order and arrangement had been agreed to at Berlin by the chief prosecutors. So the task that immediately fell to me was to prepare the opening speech which I would deliver, and to get the evidence arranged for presentation in the following weeks to support my opening remarks. I turned to the task of writing a speech. It involved some physical difficulty. For one thing, there was a constant and unremitting interruption with administrative troubles, ranging from trivial ones to most serious ones, and necessitating conferences and all sorts of things that diverted your attention and absorbed your energies. My system of operating was to go to the office in the morning in the Palace of Justice, hold such conferences as were necessary with staff people during the day, and work on the speech in the evening. It seemed almost impossible to get free daytime for that kind of work. The days in Nuremberg were short and overcast, and the electric lights at the house were either off most of the time or so low that they afforded no adequate light to read or write by. We had candles, and a good deal of the actual work on the speech was done by candlelight. I dictated some, but in the main I wrote it out in longhand, and my secretary copied it by candlelight. Then I rearranged it. We worked on it in that way, evening after evening. The speech seemed an important task to me because up to that time, no one had disclosed to the world what the case really amounted to, what the evidence was, and what law we were contending for. There had, of course, been different phases of it exposed in articles or speeches, but the whole overall picture of the Nazi conspiracy and the planned crimes had never been set forth. The newspaper correspondents had been unable to envision what we had in mind as the overall plan of the trial, even those who had long been in Germany and knew the facts. Not only the newspaper men, but many of our own staff couldn't envision it because it was necessary for them to concentrate on narrow tasks concerning special phases of the problem. The bringing together of all of the evidential material had not been done, nor its sweep and effect envisioned by many of the people there. The speech seemed likely to have important public consequences because it would be the first full disclosure of the materials that we had captured and had at hand, and of the use that we attempted to make of them. I had a rather strong sense of responsibility about the speech, recognized that it was probably the most important task of my life. The speech, of course, began to take shape as we worked on it night after night, and whatever daytime we could get, and on Sundays and on such occasional days I could take away from the office. I was much less subject to interruption at the house. The Army finally, under persistent hammering, located a small portable dynamo run by a gas engine and set it up outside of my fillet. We then got light enough so that we could dispense with the candles. One of the problems was the selection of the material to use and what to eliminate, because the quantity was so vast that it was quite impossible to cover more than a small part of it. So the selection of the evidentiary material that I would recite in the speech was very important. Colonel Story, my son, Whitney Harris, Gordon Bean, and others all were helping to dig out the kind of material that I wanted. I had many consultations with the men who were working on particular phases of the case in order to get the documents that were most useful. Because our collection screened by our staff included 100,000 documents and more, those who had done the screening selected about 5,000 of these for translation, all of them practically being in the German language in the original. We used in the trial a little over 4,000 documents. Each document, as it was translated, was made the subject of an abstract, which would indicate the persons implicated, the subject that it dealt with, and a brief of its contents. Each day I received a sheaf of those from the staff as they went from document to document. I attempted to arrange them under various headings that I wanted to use in the division of my speech. A small room, which was a sort of conservatory, opened off from the room that we were using as an office at the house. And it was all windows, except the inner wall against which stood a table. On this table I laid out in piles under different titles the abstracts of the evidence that impressed me as being useful. I did it under protest from my secretary, who thought, of course, she ought to file them. But I argued that I couldn't see them all in a file, and I wanted them laid out so that I could see the whole collection on this table. I assembled them gradually into piles on which I had noted the headings of subjects that I wanted to use for the speech. About the time that these neat piles were ready for use, which included 1,000 at least separate pieces of paper piled up in different piles, the housekeeper left the windows open to air out, as Germans do during the day. A storm came up, and all of my collection of abstracts either went out the window or were soaked with rain and piled up all over the floor. So I had to go to work and make a new collection with considerable profanity. And I think a little bit of sardonic satisfaction on the part of my secretary, who had insisted that that was a wonderful way of assembling material. We wrote and rewrote and revised and rearranged. I have no idea how many typings of that speech my secretary made, or how many times I rewrote paragraphs by hand, but it was a long, hard, grinding job, but one with some inspiration in it. I enjoyed it. I wouldn't say that I felt any grievance having to do it. That's the end of the quotation. Now, what did Nuremberg accomplish? My father made his own assessment in his report to President Truman after the trial was over and the sentences were carried out. This is a little-known document, too often ignored by writers on the subject. Again, in his own words, let me give you a few excerpts from this report to the President. In a world torn with hatreds and suspicions, where passions are stirred by the frantic close to foolish word, the four powers have given the example of submitting their grievances against these men to a dispassionate inquiry on legal evidence. The nations have given the example of leaving punishment of individuals to the determination of independent judges, guided by principles of law, and after hearing all of the evidence for the defense as well as the prosecution. We have documented in German sources Nazi aggressions, persecutions, and atrocities with such authenticity and in such detail that there can be no responsible denial of these crimes in the future, and no tradition of martyrdom of the Nazi leaders can arise among informed people. No history of this era can be entitled to authority which fails to take into account the record of Nuremberg. And then he went on to what seems to me to be one of the most cogent lessons of the trial. And I'm quoting again. It has been well said that this trial is the world's first post-mortem examination of a totalitarian regime. In this trial, the Nazis themselves, with Machiavellian shamelessness, exposed their methods of subverting people's liberties and establishing their dictatorship. The record is a merciless expose of the cruel and sordid methods by which a militant minority seized power, suppressed opposition, set up secret police and concentration camps. They resorted to legal devices such as protective custody, which Goering frankly said meant the arrest of people not because they had committed any crime, but because of acts it was suspected they might commit left at liberty. They destroyed all judicial remedies for the citizen and all protections against terrorism. The record discloses the early symptoms of dictatorship and shows that it is only in its incipient stages that it can be brought under control. And the testimony records the German example that the destruction of opposition produces eventual deterioration in the government that does it. By progressive intolerance, a dictatorship, by its very nature, becomes so arbitrary that it cannot tolerate opposition, even when it consists merely of the correction of misinformation or the communication to its highest officers of unwelcome intelligence. It was really the recoil of the Nazi blows at liberty that destroyed the Nazi regime. They struck down freedom of speech and press and other freedoms which pass as ordinary civil rights with us so thoroughly that not even its highest officers dared to warn the people or the Fuhrer that they were taking a road to destruction. The Nuremberg Trial has put that handwriting on the wall for the oppressor as well as the oppressed to read. Thank you.
Bill, that is absolutely one of the greatest talks we've ever heard about the trial and the great role of your father and yourself in that trial. I learned a lot myself here this afternoon. Thank you for coming and giving